The Emperor Alexias, after having expelled the invaders from the European portion of his empire, desired to recover Asia Minor and Syria. The disunion among the Turks seemed to afford him an excellent opportunity. But he felt the need of additional soldiers, because his own forces had been weakened by the continuous warfare of the preceding years. He was unable to obtain recruits from Asia Minor as he had done in the past. Consequently, he turned his attention to the west. For a long time the emperors had been accustomed to take into their service Danes, Englishmen, and other adventurers from the west who formed the Varangian Guard, the emperor's most efficient corps. In 1074, after the disastrous defeat in Asia Minor, an appeal for troops had been made by the emperor to Gregory VII, and an army of 50,000 men had been raised for the aid of the Eastern Empire. But the investiture struggle and other troubles had prevented the Pope from sending this assistance. In 1095, Alexius made a new request for aid to expel the Turks from his Asiatic dominions. The fact that this appeal was made to the Pope is an excellent illustration of the condition of affairs at the close of the 11th century. Notwithstanding the long investiture struggle, the Pope was the only possible source of aid in Western Europe. The German king was powerless to aid Alexius. He was barely able to maintain his own position against his rebellious subjects and his son. The French king was under the ban of excommunication, and possessed too little real power to give aid to anyone. In England, William Rufus was engaged in quelling the revolt of the barons, which had been occasioned by his tyrannical rule. In Spain, the kings were occupied in warfare with the Moors. No one of the other countries had as yet secured a position of importance in the affairs of Europe. The emperor's ambassadors presented themselves at the Council of Piacenza in March 1095 and appealed for aid. The Pope, Urban II, took up the matter in earnest, and during the succeeding months matured his plans. He decided to begin the movement in France, where the people were suffering from the evils caused by overpopulation. Accordingly, at the Council of Clermont, in November, after the other business had been finished, he made an eloquent address to the people, urging them to undertake a crusade. He depicted the dangers and disasters which threatened the Byzantine Empire. He dwelt upon the cruel treatment of the Christians in the East, and the desecration of the holy places by the Turks. He contrasted the opportunities in the land flowing with milk and honey with their own sad lot in France. He promised that Christ would be their leader, and that the journey should take the place of all other penance for their sins. Many orations have been delivered with as much eloquence and in as fiery words as the Pope used, but no other oration has ever been able to boast of as wonderful results. The people cried out, "It is the will of God," and rushed forward by thousands to receive the cross, the symbol of their vow. For the Pope had appealed to the most powerful motives of the age. Many were incited by religious zeal. Some were inspired with military ardour. Others desired to better their condition. Still others were attracted by the promise of the remission of penance. In the minds of many, the various motives combined, and it is impossible to say which was the most powerful incentive. Although the undertaking had been begun for the purpose of carrying aid to the Greek Empire, the Pope and the Crusaders subordinated this purpose to the plan of reconquering Jerusalem and of obtaining possession of the Holy Land. During the winter of 1095 to 1096, members of the Church were busily engaged in preaching the crusade. Peter the Hermit was the most active and the most successful. He journeyed through the middle of France to Paris, and from there to Cologne, preaching to the people as he went. Everywhere he met with an enthusiastic reception, and found many recruits who abandoned their homes and followed him. The Pope had fixed August 15th, 1096, as the date of departure for the Crusaders, but the men who followed Peter were too impatient to wait. One band set off on April 15th, a second, led by Peter himself a few days later. 3 others followed in rapid succession. These bands were composed of men, women, and children, mostly French and Germans. There were comparatively few knights. The greater part of the host which started with Peter were from the city of Cologne and its vicinity. As he marched through Germany, 2 bishops and over 20 knights joined him. These bands marched across Germany, through Hungary and Bulgaria, and down to Constantinople. Many perished by the way, some were driven back, and those who reached Constantinople were so disorderly that the emperor urged them to cross over into Asia Minor, where most of them were slaughtered by the Turks. During the summer and fall of the year 1096, the great nobles and the real army of Crusaders set out for the Holy Land. The most noteworthy leaders were Godfrey of Bouillon, who afterwards became the ruler of Jerusalem, and Bohemund, son of Robert Guiscard. The host was composed of men from all the nations of Western Europe, but French and Normans were most numerous. They marched by different routes and did not join together into one army until they reached the city of Nicaea in the summer of 1097. The army may then have numbered some hundreds of thousands, if all the monks, women, children, and camp followers were included, but the effective force probably did not amount to over 100,000 men. This number, however, would have been amply sufficient for the conquest of Asia Minor, Syria, and Palestine, if the Greek emperor had given efficient aid, and if discipline had been maintained among the Crusaders. Alexias had asked for assistance, but had not counted upon the coming of such a host. Moreover, he was alarmed when he heard that his old enemy Bohemund was with the Crusaders. But the opportunity was too tempting to be neglected, and he determined to use the army for his own purposes. As the leaders arrived separately at Constantinople, Alexias endeavoured to obtain from each one an oath of vassalage, so that all the conquests might be subject to the imperial authority. The emperor used every means to effect this. He tried in turn violence, bribery, and promises. He succeeded finally in obtaining some kind of oath from every leader, but in doing so he aroused a feeling of bitter animosity among the Crusaders. After Nicaea had been besieged and practically captured by the Crusaders, the latter found themselves deprived of their booty by the emperor, who had persuaded the citizens to surrender to him. The leaders whom he bribed withdrew with kindly feelings, others with different emotions. After this, the Crusaders received no aid from the emperor, and many came to regard him as an enemy. From Nicaea the army proceeded slowly to Antioch, which was taken after a siege of over 7 months, and then to Jerusalem, which was captured July 15th, 1099. There had been many delays due to the lack of discipline in the army, and to the desire of the chiefs to make conquests for their own advantage. A participant complained that each one wished only the greatest possible advantage to himself, and thought not at all of the common good. Baldwin, the brother of Godfrey, had left the army in order to obtain possession of Edessa. Bohemund had remained at Antioch, which he had secured, and was more intent upon building up a strong principality there than upon aiding in the capture of Jerusalem. Others had deserted the host for the sake of holding fortresses which they had captured, and many more had grown disheartened because of the dangers and privations on the long march, and had returned home. There had been no recognized head to the army, and no means of restraining the individual Crusaders. Each one had done just as he pleased. After conquering Jerusalem, the Crusaders elected Godfrey, Baron and defender of the Holy Sepulchre. When he died in the following year, His brother Baldwin was elected king. Conquests were added to the kingdom from time to time, until it included most of the cities and villages near Jerusalem. In addition, the county of Tripoli, the principality of Antioch, and the county of Edessa were held by the Franks. (Footnote: A collective name for all men from the west.) From north to south, the extreme length of the states founded by the Crusaders was about 525 miles. The breadth was, except in the north, 50 miles or less. Much of this territory was rocky and barren, and the fertile portions along the coast and those in the interior were separated by mountains. There were Mohammedan cities and fortresses scattered along the whole eastern frontier, and no Christian city was distant more than a day's ride from some Mohammedan stronghold. Consequently, border raids were very frequent. Their position forced the Franks to depend to a large extent upon the natives, whom they were obliged to employ constantly. The Crusaders were relatively few in number, and were engaged in military service or in commerce. Their lands were cultivated by the native Syrians, who were either Christian or Mohammedan. Their houses were built and their churches adorned by Greeks or Armenian architects and artists. Their sick were doctored by the Jewish or Arab doctors. Their merchants traded extensively with all the natives. In warfare, the Mohammedans and the Westerners learned to respect each other's valour. In times of peace, they mingled freely with each other, and sometimes intermarried. In these various ways, the Franks were brought into constant and intimate association with the more advanced civilizations of the East. They acquired new tastes, new habits, and new ideals, and when they returned, they introduced these into their homes. The success of the Christians in the early decades of the 12th century caused the Mohammedans to unite in self-defense. Zengi, the ruler of Mosul, was the first to check the advance of the Christians. He was engaged from 1127 to 1143 in making himself supreme over all the Moslem lords in the north. He then turned his forces against Edessa, which he captured in 1144. The news of the fall of this city aroused the inhabitants of Western Europe to renewed exertions. Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany led great armies to the Holy Land, but dissensions among the Christians caused the entire failure of the expedition, and the kings returned without having accomplished anything. Some imputed their failure to the treachery of the Greek emperor, but the majority blamed some of the Franks who lived in the Holy Land, and during the next 40 years requests for aid were received coldly in the West. Although it has never been possible to determine the exact truth, it is probable that the failure of the Second Crusade was due to the attitude of certain Franks settled in the East. For many of the Crusaders did not wish to wage war, but preferred to maintain cordial relations with the Moslems. There had been a great change in the character of the Franks who settled in the Holy Land. The early Crusaders had been mainly Normans, and men from the north who loved fighting for its own sake. Those who came later were to a great extent Italians and men from the south of Europe, who were interested in commerce and consequently desired peace. In general, after the Second Crusade, the majority of the Franks who were living in Syria were averse to war. The new arrivals and the military orders of the Templars and Hospitallers were the ones desirous of fighting with the infidels, yet even the members of the two orders frequently entered into friendly relations with the Moslems. (Footnote. The Order of the Templars was founded in 1119 to protect pilgrims in Palestine. They took their name from the Temple of Solomon, near which their original dwelling was placed. The Order of the Hospitallers grew out of a brotherhood to nurse the sick in the Hospital of St. John the Baptist, established at Jerusalem in 1070. This brotherhood was changed into a military order on the model of the Templars. Its members were known later as Knights of St. John and Knights of Malta. The order still exists, with its headquarters at Rome. These two orders became the most powerful defenders of the kingdom of Jerusalem. Back to main text. The peace party was the more numerous and was able usually to maintain peace, but war might be caused at any time by some aggression on the Mohammedans by the war party. In 1187, during a period of truce, one of the Frankish lords rashly attacked and plundered a Mohammedan caravan. This caused the fall of Jerusalem. For most of the Moslems were now united under the leadership of Saladin, the great hero and the ablest leader whom the Crusaders encountered. Aroused by this breach of peace, he attacked the Christians, annihilated their army in a single battle, captured their king, and in a few weeks conquered almost all the cities in the south, including Jerusalem. The news of the fall of the Holy City aroused Europe from its apathy regarding the Crusades. Frederick Barbarossa of Germany, Philip Augustus of France, and Richard the Lion-hearted of England took the cross and led great armies to the east in the Third Crusade, 1189 to 1192. Frederick died before reaching Palestine, and his troops separated, some continuing their march as far as Acre, and others returning home. Richard and Philip, after a long siege, succeeded in recapturing Acre, but quarrelled so bitterly that Philip returned home. After his departure, Richard accomplished nothing of importance, but by his personal valour he made a deep impression upon the Moslems, and has become a hero of romance. The popes continued to urge the need of a new crusade, and many thousands took the cross, but little was accomplished until the Fourth Crusade, 1202 to 1204, when a number of French knights were induced to join in the movement. They realized that it was necessary to go by sea, and bargained with the Venetians to furnish vessels. They met at Venice, but at the time agreed upon comparatively few were present, and these could not pay all the sum promised for the vessels. After long delay they were persuaded by the Venetians to earn the balance of the money by capturing Zara, a city on the opposite side of the Adriatic, which was drawing away trade from Venice. Many of the Crusaders were opposed to this because Zara was a Christian city, but were powerless to prevent it. After the capture of Zara, the Crusaders were persuaded by the Venetians to go to Constantinople, with the ostensible purpose of reinstating Alexias, the lawful heir, whose father had been driven out by a usurper. Alexias promised a large sum of money and offered many inducements. Although the Pope ordered them not to go to Constantinople, the majority disobeyed, and succeeded in reinstating Alexias and his father. It had been very easy for Alexias, when he was an exile, to make promises, but after he and his father were reinstated in power, they could not fulfil the agreements. Consequently, the Crusaders attacked and sacked the city, and established the Latin Empire of Constantinople, which lasted for 57 years, from 1204 to 1261. By the sack they obtained a great amount of booty, but their whole conduct was indefensible and criminal. Constantinople was a Christian city, and had been for centuries the great bulwark of Europe against the Turks. It was so weakened by this wanton attack that it never regained its strength, and in 1453 was captured with comparative ease by the Turks. Many believed that the Crusades had failed because of the sinful lives of the Crusaders, and that if the pure in heart should undertake a crusade under divine guidance, they would be successful. This feeling led to the Children's Crusade in 1212, when many thousands of boys and girls, with some older people, started on a peaceful crusade to convert the Moslems and to recover Jerusalem. The movement began near Paris, and from there extended to the Rhine Valley. Most of the French children returned home after a few weeks without leaving France. The German children marched up the Rhine across the Alps and down into Italy, expecting the Mediterranean to open and leave a passage, as the Red Sea had done for the children of Israel. Some were induced by crafty men to embark in vessels and were sold into slavery to the Mohammedans. Many remained in Italy. The others returned home after some months of wandering. This expedition is of importance because it illustrates the extent to which the religious zeal for the Crusades still existed among the people of France and Germany. In 1229, Frederick II, by diplomacy, persuaded the Moslem ruler to cede Jerusalem to the Christians. Later, St. Louis took the cross and attempted to conquer Egypt, the chief seat of the Moslem power. His campaign began successfully, but eventually he was taken prisoner and compelled to pay a ransom to secure his freedom. In 1270 he started on a second expedition, which was directed to Tunis, where St. Louis died of the plague. During this and the succeeding centuries there were many other crusades against the Moslems in the East, but none of especial importance. After 1229 the Franks held Jerusalem for 15 years and lived on friendly terms with the Moslems. It was a period of prosperity for the Christian colonies, which were the seats of extensive commerce, wealth, and refinement. But in 1244 a new horde of Turks swept over Syria and Palestine, conquering the cities and destroying civilization. The Franks lost one stronghold after another, until their possessions were restricted to the single city of Acre. Finally, this was captured by the Turks in 1291, and the Crusaders were compelled to withdraw from the land which they had held for nearly 2 centuries. It is very difficult to determine the extent to which the Crusades influenced Western Europe. During the 12th and 13th centuries, great changes took place in every country, and it is possible in many instances to attribute these in part to the influence of the Crusades. Thus, although the great increase in the power of the kings of France was not caused by the Crusades, the kings profited by the absence of the adventurous and ambitious men who went on crusades. There were undoubtedly fewer private wars, when so many turbulent knights had left France, and this was a positive blessing. The position of the French peasants was not changed materially by the Crusades, but after the first, the evils of overpopulation, which had been so great in the 11th century, were no longer felt. Food was more plentiful and labour in greater demand. In many ways, which will be apparent in the following chapters, the Crusades aided in effecting results which were due mainly to other causes. Of the direct results, the most important was the broadening of the intellectual horizon. Hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children took part in the various Crusades. They came from all the countries of Western Europe, and in their travels were brought into contact with many different nations and civilizations. They acquired new tastes and new ideas. They lost many of their prejudices against foreigners and foreign ways when they were brought into actual contact with them. In fact, they profited by one of the most effective means of education, travel in foreign lands. As the people who stayed at home were eager to hear of the strange lands and adventures, poems and histories of the Crusades were written in the vernacular, and thus more people shared in the intellectual awakening. Some additions to their knowledge were made. For instance, the Crusaders learned the use of windmills, and soon these were scattered all over Western Europe. The Crusaders also learned to like spiced foods, and consequently spices, which had been very rare before, came into common use. But more important than the special acquisitions was the general broadening influence. Yet even the great intellectual advance during the 12th and 13th centuries was not due wholly to the Crusades. It had begun before the First Crusade. In history, it is seldom possible to attribute any great change to a single cause. A second very important result was the impetus to commerce. Many of the Crusaders went by sea, and large vessels were built to carry them, their horses, and their supplies. The vessels on their return furnished a ready means of carrying commodities to the West. The cost of transportation was almost eliminated, as many of the vessels would have been compelled to return empty if they had not secured these commodities. The Crusaders in the Holy Land needed supplies from the West. Those who returned home desired the luxuries with which they had become acquainted in the East. As Crusaders in larger or smaller numbers were going to the Holy Land by sea, each year an active trade was maintained, and the people in the West gradually learned to use and need the Oriental products. As long as the Syrian seaports were held by the Christians, it was from these cities that Europe obtained spices, sugar, silks, glassware, dyestuffs, and many other commodities which were brought from China, India, and Arabia. The Italian ports furnished most of the vessels and profited especially by this trade. From Italy, the eastern commodities were carried over the Alps and down the rivers to the German, French, and Flemish cities. From the latter, many wares were shipped to England. This trade enriched the inhabitants of the cities and aided in the rise of the Third Estate. This commerce necessitated an abundant supply of money. Before 1204, the Crusades did not bring into Western Europe any great additions to the actual stock of gold and silver, but they caused almost all the existing stock to be used as money. When the nobles made their preparations to leave home, they needed supplies and equipment for their journey. They obtained money to buy these things by selling or mortgaging their fiefs, or by selling privileges to citizens and others. The gold and silver which had been hoarded, often in the shape of ornaments, were turned into money to pay for the lands or privileges. The churches and monasteries used much of their wealth in this way, and became more wealthy by buying fiefs at a low price. The money which was brought into use circulated rapidly and furnished the capital for trade. All the Western countries were enriched. The kings, the churches, and the cities shared in this prosperity more than the nobles. Heraldic devices and family names came into use during the time of the Crusades, and mainly from the conditions in the Holy Land. When clad in armour, knights could not be distinguished easily from one another. As a rule, each one had to adopt some device by which his fellows could tell him in battle. The sprig of broom plant, from which they took their name, marked the Plantagenets. In the Holy Land this custom was widely extended, and resulted in armorial bearings. Many of the terms in heraldry betray their Eastern origin, as they are merely Arabic words taken over into French. Family names developed rapidly in the Holy Land for the same reason. When there were many knights named Gilbert or Godfrey or Stephen, it was necessary that each one should be known by some distinctive epithet. In his own home, where the knight was all-powerful, where he was living for the most part at his castle in the country, it had been entirely unnecessary for him to have any distinguishing name. Lord Hugh or Lord Gilbert represented something very definite. But in the crusading hosts, each one had to have some distinctive epithet. These names were derived from personal peculiarities or from the place in which the men had lived previously. Broadhead, Strong, White, Byfield, Atwater will suggest such derivations. Other names came from the occupations in which the men had been engaged. Smith and Clerk are the most common examples.